Welcome, friends, to another edition of Devotionables, brief devotions for busy people. I'm Tim Mamix, and this week we're going to be in the Holy Scriptures in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And what we know about the book of Corinthians is that it's an epistle. It's a letter from Paul, the Apostle Paul, to the church at Corinth. And Paul is hoping that he's on his way to see the people at Corinth in the not too distant future. We also know that in part, at least, this is a letter of correction. It's a letter of rebuke. And Paul is correcting their wrong living, their sinfulness, and their wrong living is rooted in their wrong beliefs. Just as it's true for us, it's true for the church at Corinth and the Corinthians. They live a life that demonstrates what they believe. And so they've got some wrong beliefs, and one of them is this belief about the resurrection. And Paul addresses that in chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians. And I think he breaks this into three pieces for us, and I'll try to summarize each one of them with a one line. The first thing Paul says is Christ was resurrected. He says, the gospel that I preached to you, which you received, was that Christ was resurrected. And he goes on to say that Jesus rose and he appeared to Peter, and then he appeared to the disciples, and then to more than 500 believers at once, some of which were still alive at the time Paul's writing to tell the story. And then he appeared to James, and then the apostles, and then lastly to Paul himself. And so he says, you are saved because of the resurrection. And then the next point Paul makes is that if Christ was resurrected, then the dead must be resurrected. He's talking to people, you see, who accept that Jesus was resurrected from the dead. They accept the gospel. They believe, but they were struggling to believe in the resurrection of the dead. And whether that had to do with their Greek philosophy or maybe some Jewish Sadducees were teaching and preaching, we don't know. But what we do know is that Jesus himself taught about the resurrection of the dead. And in John in particular, chapters 5 and 6 and 11 and 14, Jesus teaches about the resurrection. In fact, in chapter 11, verse 25 of John, he says this, one of his great I am statements, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And so Paul says, you must believe. How could Christ be raised if the dead can't be raised? And then Paul expounds on that a little bit to say what it means. He says, look at my life. You see, Paul had just came from Ephesus where the people were rioting and sought to lay hands on him. And before that, he had been in Lystra where they had stoned him and left him for dead. He faced death and physical harm and persecution every day of his life. And Paul's saying, why would I choose that? If all I had left were the minutes, hours, and days of this world, why would I choose that way to live them? And so what I think Paul's saying there is you live a life of service to Christ and his church because of the resurrection. And then the last thing, Paul gets very personal. He says what this means for them individually. He says things like you're going to trade the perishable for the imperishable. You'll give up dishonor for glory, weakness for power, the natural for the spiritual. And then he continues in verse 54. When the perishable puts on the imperishable and the mortal puts on immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that is written. And I hope you've heard this before. Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God, who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. And your labor is not in vain because you live for the hope of the resurrection. And so Paul is saying the hope of the resurrection means you are sanctified because you live for the resurrection. So the 3 points I think Paul makes for us in this chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians, he says you are saved because of the resurrection, you live a life of service because of the resurrection, and you are sanctified because of the resurrection. Go in peace.